Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's forum. Very pleased to have with us Lowell Weicker. We had a little quandary today about how we should bill this event, because as you know, we have a presidential candidate series that will be going on throughout the fall, when we hope to have all of the basic presidential candidates come speak to us here at Harvard. And there are many citizens who have said the gentleman we're going to hear from tonight ought to be running for president of the United States, and there are a number of American journalists who have said that and speculated that he will run for president of the United States. And maybe you'll get the answer in a question you might ask tonight, but I wouldn't be so bold as to pose a question like that, since I never was in journalism. But as you may also know, he has recently published with Barry Sussman a book entitled Maverick. And no one believes the title is not apt. There's no problem of truth in advertising here for this gentleman's career. Maverick tells about the various battles on American public policy, both at the state, the local, and the federal level, that he has been involved in. Now, some critics, as you know, in our society today constantly believe that politics is a place in which you simply have to go along. And they usually wash their hands of it because of that phenomenon as they see it. But we have before us somebody who clearly is a demonstration that you don't have to go along with an interest group, you don't have to go along with a political party, you don't even have to go along with your constituents on occasion. And you can still advance from being what those of us in the Midwest would have called a mayor. I believe you call it the first selectman in Connecticut, to being in the state assembly, to being in the U.S. House of Representatives, to being in the United States Senate, and most recently being governor of the state of Connecticut. In addition, there are those who say, of course, that being a maverick, well, yes, you can be a maverick in American politics, and you can simply say things that are outrageous and go along, and somehow you'll be elected, but you won't really accomplish anything. Well, wrong again. We have an example of somebody who at every level of his service has demonstrated that, well, he may not have won all the battles, but he's fought a lot of key ones and won a lot of key ones, advancing people's rights, advancing the protection of folks who are disabled in our society, advancing the level of primary care, health care available to people, helping achieve scientific advancement in marine biology, in the health sciences. And indeed, he first came onto the national scene when he was a Republican member of the Watergate Investigating Committee. Now, historically, you can look back and say, well, obviously, it was easy what one should have done at that point. One should have asked tough questions of the President of the United States, or rather of the President's top aides. But in reality, at that time, it was not the kind of thing that was wise to do politically. And indeed, it was to ask of his own party. And he captured the national attention, the national imagination, because he stood up. And in the end, history proved him right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce the recipient of the Profiles in Courage Award, the former governor of Connecticut, and the current chairman of the International Special Olympics, Lowell Weicker. Thank you.
Well, I must confess it's good to be back, having taught here and spent some enjoyable hours with the school. And Phil, I wish you the best of luck here as you take over this enterprise. There's nothing really more important than what goes on here. I want to make each one of you feel good to the extent that enough of this business of people bad-mouthing and spitting on politics and politicians. You know, we all ought to be out there encouraging our children and encouraging young people to get into the business. The country's not going to be any better than the people that serve it. And what worries me more than anything else is the fact that we're making it so disagreeable that, you know, who wants to go into it? And it isn't just a question of what worries me even more than those of us that are elected, because we sort of ask for it. I mean, who are you going to get to appoint to all these other positions in government in terms of the treatment they're going to receive? It used to be that as one concluded a successful career, they wanted to give something back to their town or to their state or to their nation, and they wanted to serve. And not the way the game is played today. So You know, I come from a point of view that's considerably different than anything that you hear, which is I admire those that do serve. And I want to tell you something else. As Phil has said, I've served at every single level of government, except for the last stop on the line. And so I think I know the men and women that do serve. And 98% of them, 99% of them are extraordinarily dedicated, extraordinarily honest. No pay for the jobs that are held, believe me. All the abuse in the world, the longest possible hours. So, you know, enough of this stuff. I mean, I'll go along with accuracy in characterization, but what's being done now is an assassination, and which in effect is a neutering of our political system, and that is not good. Now, listen, what I'm going to do is talk for a few minutes here this evening, and then let's get to the Q&A, which I prefer anyway. But I want to talk for a minute about this matter of independence in politics. And I'm going to add another dimension to it this evening that I think has to be said or stated in terms of the men or women who might emerge as the candidates of third or maybe even fourth parties. First of all, let me say this, that forget this concept which is consistently thrown out there either by the present two major parties or even the media, that an independent candidacy or movement is sort of a spoiler operation. I mean, when I ran for governor of Connecticut, the Democratic Party almost became a minor party. By 1 percentage point, they stayed a major party. I mean, who's the spoiler? I mean, because somebody else wants to compete, they're a spoiler? That's propaganda coming forth for those that hold down the fort right now. Can an independent govern? Yeah. I had no problem governing. You put together entirely different coalitions based not so much on partisanship and on philosophy as on some rather important characteristics, integrity, vision, courage, you know, that should matter in terms of what government does. I can't think of anything worse than partisanship and philosophy as being a basis for decisions that affect all American citizens. So whether it's the running or whether it's the governing, independents enjoy just as solid a position in the American political process as the two presently established major parties. Why does anybody think that an intellectual exercise such as politics is going to be any different than what goes on, let's say, in the economic sphere? Why do you think that a political monopoly is going to have a different result than an economic monopoly? In the case of an economic monopoly, you know, bad products, high prices. In the case of a political monopoly, bad candidates, bad ideas. Now everybody's nibbling around the edges as to how do we get this system to work for us. And we hear about campaign financing reform, and we hear about term limits, and got down the whole checklist. I say it's nibbling around because to my way of thinking, the way you get at it is the same way you get at an economic monopoly. Competition, pure and simple, American style, free enterprise. Except here we have a free system that permits for the best to step forward and the best ideas to step forward. That's how radical this it just goes to show you the sway that the, quote, two-party system has on us, that we consider this sort of radical thinking in the land of free enterprise. I can't think of anything more American that have competition in politics. And it's for that reason that I and others have for quite a while now suggested that, yeah, the laws of the United States, whether it's financing laws or whether it's access laws, ought to permit for parties other than the Republican and Democratic parties. I mean, I come from the position that it is the politics of the United States that is strangling the governing of the United States. That the candidates have to get out there and make one commitment after another which completely neuters them for performing their duties when they do get elected. How can anybody, quote, take a pledge on a matter of taxes or services before they get into office? How do you take a pledge? You're going to predict the next 4 years as to what's going to happen? I don't think so. And yet that type of, quote, pledge takes place all the time during campaigns to make us all feel good. So I think the important thing to remember is, what is the present system doing to us? And what it's doing is to eliminate any hope for leadership once the election's over. We have moved from a politics of accountability to the politics of re-electability or electability at any cost. And the cost is what you're paying. And that has changed. This has not always been with us. In 1968, I won my first major office, which was the 4th congressional seat in Connecticut, ousted an incumbent Democrat. There was a big issue in that campaign. He was a Johnson pro-war Democrat, pro the Vietnam War. I was against the Vietnam War and America's participation in it. That was the issue of the campaign. And we both knew from our respective stands we would rise or fall on that issue. And nobody fuzzed it or hedged it. I won in the sense that's what the constituency wanted. Now, we've come a long way from that kind of a politics. Any tough issue today, any tough issue, is fuzzed and given a soft landing insofar as the proposed solution. And there's a big problem here, ladies and gentlemen. It is that we can kid ourselves politically, but reality, you don't kid reality. And if it's a tough problem, it's going to require a tough solution. So that's why I think the time has come to get someone other than the Republicans and Democrats out there, because it's clear that the monopoly and the soft landings and the neutering is creating a hell of a leadership problem in the governing. All this came into very sharp focus when I was governor of Connecticut, and we had the very controversial issue of the income tax. And when I took office, Connecticut, the wealthiest state in the Union per capita income, wealthiest state in the Union, had the biggest percentage deficit of any state in the Union. $1 billion real deficit on a $7 billion budget. Sort of sound familiar as far as the United States is concerned? The wealthiest state in the Union, the biggest deficit in the world. Well, that was Connecticut. And when I campaigned, I wasn't for an income tax. I never was for an income tax throughout my political career in Connecticut. But it became clear as we crunched the numbers that income tax was the only thing that was not only going to work in eliminating the deficit, but in keeping us in the black. And indeed, circumstances prove that to be correct as the next 4 years of the administration we were in the black and reported surpluses every year. But the point that I want to make here is during the debate, a coalition of conservative Democrats and Republicans got together to present 3 different alternative budgets, all 3 of which were grossly out of balance, all of which were soft landings. And in their getting together, they promised each other that anybody that is signed up would not be contested in the next election. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is what goes on. That was de jure, if you will, that commitment. This goes on de facto in Washington all the time and has been on the toughest issues confronting the United States. That partnership has been there. So it really isn't a duopoly on the tough issues. It's a monopoly. And we can't afford that. And again, I have no radical solution, only the solution of competition. Now, this is the lesson that I've tried to bring home. And let me say another thing here, and I realize that Clay's here, and I'm not saying just because I'm in his presence, because quite frankly, I agree in one sense and disagree in another with Ross Perot. But all right, how many other Americans are willing to go out there and put their money where their mouth is and try to shake up the system? I disagree with the specifics on different positions on issues and all the rest with Mr. Perot, but how many people are willing to go out there and say we need to have competition? I mean, how many people would have gone out there 2 years ago and said this budget needs balancing? You don't think the Republicans and Democrats were talking about balancing a budget before Ross Perot got into the act a couple of years ago. Forget it. They weren't even mentioning it. So, say what you will, have your own opinions. The fact still is, this man has made a contribution to politics. I wish I could get as much of a contribution from every American, because believe me, we'd straighten things out very fast around here. But for everybody just to go along with the flow, and what's been the case in the past, is the very reason that we have the problems that we do today. Now, I want to say one thing more here this evening that I've not commented upon. As far as reforming the structure of politics, yeah, I believe very much in permitting for independent challenges. And in that sense, obviously, eliminating the ballot access laws that make it so difficult for independents to run, and also eliminating the present campaign financing, which favors just the Republicans and the Democrats. But it won't do any good. It won't do any good to put into place such an independent challenge unless the candidates of the independent parties are willing to bring to pass a new politics of candor and realism. In other words, just having a third party out there, but in effect having a third soft landing, isn't going to do it. And so my comments tonight really are addressed to the American people, because I hold them even more responsible than those that they like to point the finger at. It's wonderful to say it's Gingrich or Dole or Clinton, it's Washington or Hartford or Boston. One thing. Love to point the finger at all these entities. Hey, everybody forgets the uniqueness of America. We're the government. We are the government. And we make things happen or not. How many of you here saw that great movie? If you haven't, please go get it, because it's one of the great efforts of public television, Simple Justice, which is the story of Thurgood Marshall and Brown versus the Board of Education. And I advise everybody to see it, because it really does illustrate the magnificence of the total process here in the United States. Thurgood Marshall and Charlie Houston, who was the dean of the law school at Howard, went right shortly after establishing the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, went down to South Carolina to examine the schools available to the minority community of South Carolina. And needless to say, they were a horror show. And on that visit, they had the local minister bring together the parents in a church there, where they were introduced to the parents, and they explained their mission, which was to try to get some people to stand up and be part of a lawsuit against the Board of Education. And as the minister introduced Dean Houston and Thurgood Marshall, saying that they were from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in New York City, a couple of people just rose up in their seats and said, my God, these fellows are from New York City and they belong to the NAACP. We don't have anything to do with it, because as soon as this meeting's over tonight, you fellows are going back up to New York City and you're going to leave us with the problems of the schools down here. And the place cleared out en masse. They had nobody to talk to. And they certainly had no clients. Several years later, a black parent in Clarendon County, South Carolina, had their child denied on a procedural motion transportation to school. School being, the nearest school for that child being some 4 or 5 miles away. And a hearing on it was denied, and the NAACP was down there when it occurred, and Marshall again addressed the parents, and this time everybody in that room stood up and said they wanted to be part of a class action against Clarendon County, South Carolina Board of Education. And that was one of 3 cases, that and the Virginia case in Topeka, that formed the basis for Brown versus the Board of Education. And I cite this story because I try to bring it down to the smallest possible constituency, that nothing happened as long as everybody walked out of the room, in this case out of fear, but they walked out of a room just like we like to walk out of tough situations in this country. But when they wanted to be part of that action, it happened. And because they made that decision is the reason why the decision Brown versus the Board of Education took place. And it's the reason why Plessy versus Ferguson was overruled. What I'm saying to you is that the American people, if they think for 1 minute that, as we read in the polls now, independence is a great thing, it doesn't mean a damn unless they insist that very tough, realistic positions be taken by the candidates of any independent entity. That we want the truth told to us. That no, we don't want to lead our leaders. Rather, we expect them to lead. And we expect declarations against self-interest. I always cite the fact that, my God, do you realize that a handful of Virginia planters and Boston businessmen went ahead and put down on paper that Constitution, that Bill of Rights, which was against everything, every interest that they held. They were the rich, they were the powerful, they were the educated. And yet they wrote these great statements which have driven us to a pinnacle of success in the history of the world. And because they did, we don't have a handful of Virginia planters or Boston businessmen running the United States of America. Indeed, 250 million Americans, with the exception of the most destitute, etc., enjoy a quality of life far beyond anything they knew. And that's what we're unwilling to do now in terms of bringing about the change so necessary to realizing our opportunities and solving the problems around us. I mean, when somebody stands up there and says, let's have a balance the budget constitutional amendment. Sorry, Clay. My answer is very simple. Balance the damn thing, and damn's a polite word as far as I'm concerned. Balance it. During Reagan's years, when I served in the Senate, and he would constantly send us down unbalanced budgets while at the same time calling for a balance of budget constitutional amendment, I said, this is ridiculous. This is like going to the football stadium on Saturday, seeing the quarterback walk off the field into the stands and yell, we want a touchdown. Well, that's what they're doing. That's what they're doing down in Washington. They have all the power in the world. And when I sat there as I testified against this and have a United States Senator, a dear friend of mine, turn to me and say, listen, Lowell, if we had 100 guys around here like you, no, we could do it. What a commentary. What a commentary in terms of leadership. Or the number of times that I stood in the well on the floor of the United States Senate with some particular amendment or some piece of legislation, have one colleague after another go by me and say, Lowell, you're right, but I can't do it politically. And that's why I'm saying to you it has to be reformed is the politics. That then follows the governing. This is serious stuff. This isn't just sort of somebody's crazy ideas out here in terms of independence and competition. This is essential to untying the Gordian knot that right now is strangling the governing of the United States of America. So just say, balance it. There aren't any amendments. Do you realize that that state which I took over with that $1 billion deficit on the $7 billion budget, do you know the state of Connecticut has a balance the budget law? So it was achieved under a balance the budget law. Graham, Rudden, and Hollings, tell me how that balanced your budgets. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, you know, we can postpone and we can push off for time. But we can't solve our problems, and I just hope that the desire for independence of the American people isn't another buying time exercise to giving the tough answers to those problems and opportunities around us. Term limits? Term limits? Why do I want my power diminished as a citizen of the United States and whom I can choose? Let me tell you, as a practical experience, I saw an awful lot of old young people in the Congress of the United States, and I saw some very young old people. My mentor was Senator Jacob Javits of New York, and right up until the day he died from Lou Gehrig's disease, that man was a huge voice of power, even without the title United States Senator. He turned to my wife, Claudia, and I show you where you make a terrible judgment here just based on artificial certainties, you know, such as term limits or age or whatever. Only a few days before he died, my wife, Claudia, and I went to see him. My wife used to be staff director of one of the staff directors of appropriations. And of course, Jack, as I said, was my mentor and close friend and colleague. And with that respirator attached to him, he sat there in that bed. And this was about I guess Jack's been dead about 8 years now. This 8 or 9 years ago. He said, Lowell and Claudia, the next great issue confronting this country will be daycare. I mean, here's a man that's dying. I mean, you know, that's a young mind, somebody that can see way down the road, which is what we need now in terms of our governing. So forget this artificiality. You know what you do if you're the candidate on the subject of term limits? Excuse me, Clay. You turn to the people whose vote that you're asking for and tell them to get their ass down to the voting booth and vote. That's the greatest power right there in all of our hands as to getting good people in and bad people out. And when 36% of this nation votes, what the heck do you think you're going to end up with? You're going to end up with a bunch of one-issue candidates that certainly don't have the interest of an entire nation, the broad panoply of issues, you know, at heart. When we address violence in this nation, is some candidate going to get up there and finally bring the statistics to the people of this country? Never mind philosophy. I'm not talking philosophy. I'm talking a problem, a rather big problem. We love to refer to it in our own personal philosophies, but it's a very real problem, the matter of violence. I am a hunter. I can use a shotgun as well as anybody around, or a rifle. But what I don't understand is when we have 16,000 people killed by handguns, and our nearest competitor is Canada at 128, I don't consider the Canadians wimps, 128, it seems to me there's a little bit of a problem. And when those deaths are going to overtake in the young population, the number being killed on the highways, I think we better address the problem. I think at the time it's come to address that problem as to what we do about a handgun which has as its only purpose to kill or maim another human being. And yet we sit here not only not doing that, but saying, oh, let's all go ahead and let everybody go ahead and get licensed and carry a handgun on the streets of the United States. Exact opposite direction. Or everybody, assault weapons, nothing wrong with them. Nothing wrong with them? Well, I never met a sportsman with an assault weapon. I told it to the people in the state of Connecticut when we were passing some of the toughest laws in this regard. I said, if you can't kill it in 2 shots, you sure as hell aren't a sportsman. And I mentioned our children because, you know, they're so forgotten in everything that we do. as an adult population. Now, I'll tell you what the statistic is. The statistic is that for the first time in the history of the United States, generation of those born right now will be worse off economically, educationally, health-wise than the previous generation. That is the first time this has happened in the United States. Now, if you want to know where we're going, then I suggest you look at this statistic and this statistic alone, because obviously the children are a snapshot of what the situation is going to be in the future. That's the fastest snapshot you can get of the United States and what it will be 20, 25 years hence. That's our adult generation. Do you think it's time that somebody stood up and told the adults the time has come to shift priorities to the young people, to the children? Do you think there's something wrong as they go ahead and revise this great healthcare system of ours right now? Will anybody stand up there and say there is something inherently wrong with 90% of the $900 billion that's spent in healthcare, public and private? 90% going to the last 40 days of life? What does that say as to an allocation of resources for the children and for the young adults of this nation? Certainly nobody wants to die or die in pain. But to absorb that kind of a percentage, I don't think so. And I think it should be fairly put to those that are involved, because I think many of us would be glad to say, no, that isn't right, and let's start to shift off some of these resources to those that have the future ahead of them. Now, these are the kinds of statements that have to be made, no matter what the constituencies or the numbers are. You can say to me, well, Lowell, it certainly doesn't bode well for winning an election. Well, maybe not. But maybe it will go ahead and get the political dialogue back on track in this country. Right now, one bizarre statement is answered by another bizarre statement. Instead of getting fact and common sense and logic out there on the playing field. Some of these statistics are tough to answer, aren't they, if you're just trying to go ahead and schmooze the public, and that's your only object. And I suppose what bothers me, too, is the fact that we're so resistant to this change. Nobody will tell you that better than Ross and Clay over here, who's trying to overcome. I mean, ballot access law, you want to know something that's bizarre? I understand states' rights as far as election laws are concerned. I've got no problem with that. I suppose you could say there was a state interest in just about every election out there. But as I understand the election and political power in this country, there is a president for a United States. And yet we should have 50 different laws as to how somebody either runs for president or votes for the president. That's nonsense. The interesting thing is, as both political parties further enhance their irrelevancy, they legislate themselves into greater permanency. The finance laws, their conventions are paid for by all of you. And the minute a candidate is nominated, immediately, not even by mail, but by wire. I mean, what unseemly haste, all of a sudden $60, $70 million into the candidate's account. Any one of you want to run? That's what you get right there. So yeah, I think that change in terms of the structure is terribly important. But I also think change is what you and the American people have to insist on in terms of what the dialogue is going to be. And that you expect candor. And you expect people are going to tell you the things you don't want to hear. And in turn, when you come out there to vote, you're going to make declarations against self-interest. We have too much interest in self. We need declarations against self-interest, just as those men back in the 1700s. And then you take all of this into context with how the United States became prosperous. How did it become prosperous? How did it become number one? both in terms of doctrine and in terms of real dollars, by any measure at all, because we could adopt and assimilate and take change and turn it to our advantage. We were the masters of it. And now we're in a world that's exploding with change, whether it's in South Africa or whether it's in the old Soviet Union, whether it's enemies talking to each other in the Middle East or in Northern Ireland, a world exploding with change. And just at that time, when our greatest strength comes to play for the world, we're afraid of it. We're sitting here having nostalgia event after nostalgia event in the United States, and not going ahead and using our stock in trade, which is to take that change and turn it around for our benefit. And let me say something, because I know there are those out there who say, well, we certainly have change there with the contract with America. There's a great difference between change and nihilism. And believe me, that one's going to come back to bite you, the nation somewhere in some place in the anatomy. But I'm going to point out that yes, absolutely, we need change and we need creativity, and obviously the priorities change. I mean, I can talk to you, and I won't because we want to get to the Q&A about just health care alone. You know, we spent 2 years, no matter what the Republicans and Democrats say, we spent 2 years talking about how you're going to pay the bill. This isn't health care reform. 2 years, first under Clinton and then under the Republicans, on who's going to pay the bill. Let me make life very easy as you go to bed tonight. There is not enough money in the whole world to pay for our current health care practices. That's the simple fact of life. What you've got to do is to change those practices. You don't cut the budgets of the National Institutes of Health, which is cure rather than care, which will eliminate Alzheimer's and many of these diseases which have an enormous economic tag to them. You don't cut those budgets, you double those budgets. You go ahead, I would say most of us in this room, for example, do 90% of our own doctoring at an enormous saving to the healthcare system. Why do we do that? We do that because when Mom and Dad took us for our shots and to get measured and weighed and one through the other, to our physician, we also got a healthcare lesson. And we carried that healthcare lesson into adulthood. And so we know, number one, what good health practices we should follow, and also we know when to go see a doctor and when not in most instances. I would suggest to you that that same interface between doctor and child should exist in a school-based child health clinic in every school in the United States. And believe me, for whatever few dollars you put up front, the savings downstream are going to be enormous. And then what precipitated the debate in the first instance, 38 million Americans that had no access to decent health care. Do you understand that in the community health centers, you have a mechanism that works? It's been in there for 25 years, needs to be expanded. You didn't have to invent anything new. So you can see, I mean, I can go on all night with just in this area as to new ideas as to what we do, which will, not hopefully, but which will cut down that bill. Then when you get to that point, then figure out what the bill is going to be. Don't start in reverse, because what you're doing is the failings of the system today are because the system was politically devised. And now at a moment when you have your greatest opportunity to change it, you're going to give it a political cure. So yeah, change is important. Not in the nihilistic sense, but in all the innovation. Gosh, the ideas out there. When I turned to the people of the state of Connecticut and said, how do I get rid of this racial isolation in the schools of Connecticut? 83% of the minority students in 40 of the school districts out of 170. How do we get rid of it? I'm not going to tell you what we're going to do. Give me your ideas. And the ideas came from all over the state. The demagogues were cut off right at the pass and saying, oh, the governor wants busing. No, the governor wanted to make sure there was equality of opportunity. And gosh knows we've come a long way when busing was the only answer to a lot of other systems, whether it's regionalization, whether it's choice within the public system, whether it's college-based high schools, whether it's magnet schools. I go down a whole checklist. Come on, America, let's hear the ideas that are out there for all these problems and that work. That's what we've always done, and that's what we should be doing right now. I mean, You know, all these people going around saying, oh, God, we got to go ahead and just dump the whole matter overboard here. We failed. We failed? Really? I thought by just most indicia we were the #1 nation in the world in so many different areas, agriculturally, scientifically, product-wise. Go ahead and name it. Because the public school system didn't work? Oh, no. It worked. Yes, it needs change. But what a massive undertaking. No nation in the world ever did what we did. Because the Constitution of the United States was deficient? Really? To get to where we've been? I don't think so. Because what? We went ahead and made sure that through education and housing and all these different policies, we built the most stable, affluent middle class in the world in terms of numbers. We failed? I don't think so. Because we took the mentally challenged and disabled and brought them out of the dark recesses of the institutions of this country, when no other nation in the world did that, and brought them into the mainstream of our educational systems, where they could work and where they could live independently. We failed? No, we didn't fail. We always said yes to any problem that confronted us. We didn't always achieve the success we desired, but we said yes. And the problem with today's generation is it's no. It's no. And it's no again. The other day I went through a small blue-collar town in the state of Connecticut, which is having one of these school board battles, budget battles that are all over the United States as we try to tailor the youngsters to our own pocketbook as adults. And there it was, because it states exactly what they stated in this little town in Connecticut is our problem nationally. Hanging over the Anti's headquarters, those that wanted to trim the budget, was the sign, "We love you, but the answer is still no." Outrageous. We have always said yes. Tell me, as you look around the streets of Cambridge and Boston, and you see different types of individuals, where were they 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago? And I think you would agree, my God, we did an awful lot of good in this nation for an awful lot of people. Because we gave the answer yes, not the answer no, which is the governmental and the response, most importantly, of the people that run the government, the citizens of the United States. In that same movie, Simple Justice, those of you, when Marshall delivered his closing argument to the court, and the day before he'd fumbled rather badly in trying to give expression as to why Plessy versus Ferguson should have been overruled, and separate but equal was not anything that this nation should adopt as its national policy. And he hadn't done a very good job, and he was going to get one more chance to address the court. And he gave one of the most impassioned pleas for racial justice in this nation that's ever been given. And there's a line in there that will forever stick in my memory, and it's one that we ought to carry with us as we view any condition of man in this nation. He finally turned to the court and he said, "Surely you cannot close your eyes as judges to what you know to be true as men." That says it, doesn't it? We, in our capacities as the voters and citizens of the United States of America, cannot close our eyes to the conditions around us that we know to be so as men and women. This is what is at stake within the great political system that gives us all an equal voice. And I suppose what I hope for at this juncture of my life, having spent most of it in politics, is that we'll understand that responsibility and we'll act on it. Thank you very much.
For those that are new to our audience, so we always have a question period, and we will shift from one microphone to the other. We ask our folks to very briefly identify themselves, especially the students in the university, and to try to keep the questions brief so that we can maximize the number of questioners.
Thank you. My name is Avery Gardner. I'm a junior here at Harvard and a member of the Institute's Student Advisory Committee. And I'm also a resident of Maine, where we now have an independent governor in Angus King. I'd like to ask you a little bit about the new independent party that Perot has formed in the last couple of weeks, and ask you what direct effect it will have on the movement of independent candidates in the United States. Will it become an umbrella organization for most of the independent candidates that we're seeing surface in these recent and near future elections? Or will it be sort of a renaming of United We Stand and a new Perot party, not an independent party?
Clay and I were talking about this earlier, and I told him how much I admired his father-in-law for going ahead and making it possible to have a third party established in this country. And I meant what I said. I admire that. Having said that, I said, Clay, I think a tactical mistake was made in terms of implying there would be a platform which any candidate that wanted to be the nominee of that party would have to fulfill. I said, I don't think so. It's the reason why I, and I think a lot of other people, would not enter into that process. So I don't think that many of those who are centrists on the issues over a broad spectrum of issues, not just balancing the budget, are going to go ahead and avail ourselves of that process. Could be wrong, and it could very well be also that Mr. Perot might say, hey, this thing's going along pretty well, and let's forget about platforms for a minute here. Let's establish the challenge. I mean, many things can happen. But right now, my answer to you is I commend what was done, but insofar as laying on the umbrella under which the candidates would have to run, I don't think it's going to work. And I think probably you'll have, even if it does work, gets on the ballot with a candidate, you will have another independent challenge, which will be centrist intellectually, in other words, covering the broad spectrum of issues.
Governor, if I might, you several times mentioned Clay. Clay Mulford is one of our resident fellows this semester at the Institute of Politics, and you can join his study group. He's actively engaged in the third-party movement. We just had to get a plug-in for some of our other activities.
Well, and I might add, is really one of the finest young minds in American politics, and I mean that's a fine person. Yes.
Governor Weicker, I have such enormous respect for you. My name is Mary McMahon. I will soon be here, hopefully in January, if not September. I must tell you that as a child visiting New Haven and North Haven, you are at fault. Unbeknownst to you, you were my mentor. And I would like to see you very much go back to Washington. I would very much like to see you there. Two things. While I agree in essence with your speech, you always, most of you, said no to women. You said no to making advantages or space for women in Washington for many, many years. The other question I have is relative to Watergate. The Moore or Bradford affair, that was never looked at or discussed or brought to anyone's attention. I would like to say that I agree with you in terms of nearly everything you said in focusing on the need for a balanced budget. Except for term limits, I think it would be disruptive and inappropriate. I think that someone like you who has had years of experience is far more appropriate as a leader than someone who is just there for 4 years and gone.
Well, I think, first of all, please don't tell my wife that I was against women. My God. I don't think that's what the record says at all. As a matter of fact, as you know, she's very active in various aspects of the women's movement, and I've always been politically. I don't know anything about the Laura Bradford.
Moore Bradford.
I don't know anything about it.
You handled Watergate. This was the...
I was with Watergate, but don't forget, on the Watergate committee, different members of the committee handled different aspects of the investigation, so it's very possible that there was something there, but it certainly wasn't in the area that I covered. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Jed Sirota. I'm a second-year student at Harvard Law School. And some of the comments that you made about the third-party system remind me of something that I saw on Crossfire in a discussion a couple months ago with Jerry Brown and John Anderson, former independent candidate for president in 1980. Jerry Brown and John Anderson essentially agreed with each other about the need for a third-party movement, and some of the sort of logical inconsistencies in their arguments I thought were very interesting, and I had really sort of hoped that that someone would say that the emperor has no clothes. One of the things that keeps being said is that, and you said it here, is that there's a sort of monopoly here. There's this monopoly of ideas, there's a monopoly of power, and then the other thing that's said is all they do is go up there and fight with each other. They just disagree. Why don't they get together and, well, I was always under the impression that a monopoly actually sort of works together. I mean, that was part of the problem.
Exactly what I said in my comments here is they work together. They take soft landings, in other words, in combination with each other, the tough issues.
Well, then it seems to me that the criticism that nothing actually gets done doesn't really fit in with this idea that they're just working together and that's all they're doing.
Yeah, sure it does, because you can go ahead and offer a soft landing, but unless you resolve the problem, what have you achieved? Nothing.
Well, so you're saying...
I tell you what you've achieved. You've made people feel good. Well, that's the problem. I'm not in the feel-good business. God, I don't think anybody felt very good when we had to have the income tax in the state of Connecticut. It was the only thing that worked.
Well, if I can sort of finish, the other sort of thing that sort of struck me as you were talking is that most of the things that you said actually have been said in Washington in terms of the substantive issues. Things like gun control has been talked about a lot. Things like the need for education and campaign finance. These things are being talked about. I don't think it's necessary to do them in sort of the field of a third party. Well, just your comments.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's where we obviously part company, because they might be talked about, but there's been very little action on them. The death rate continues to climb. The racial isolation continues to climb. The fact that the healthcare system isn't working, that continues to create more and more problems. In other words, what I'm saying to you is the track record of the two parties is wretched, no matter which one's been in control. Now, the time has come to go ahead and make some clear-cut decisions on 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, I don't care, and solve those problems. I don't want, and the public shouldn't want, which is amazing to me, the pain if I'm not going to have something to show for it. I mean, granted, the income tax is bad, at least we have something to show for it. They reduce sales tax, reduce business taxes, staying in the black, not having to send our money to the lenders on Wall Street. There was something to show for it. And nowadays in Washington, one situation after another takes place, and we have nothing to show for it. For example, everybody says, well, make sure when you get out there on this business of balancing the budget, you don't mention the word taxes. How many of you know that right now, $900 of your taxes are going to the interest on the debt? $900. So even though they haven't raised a tax, what the hell is this? It's a tax. But just by raising the debt, you aren't brought into the pain. So that's the reason why I'm telling you right now, I am not satisfied that there's a lot more that can't be done, should be done, and what's the harm of having another competitor out there in the field? Yes.
Good evening, Governor. My name is Andrew Richard, and I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School who hopes to work with the city of Bridgeport as they address the issue of gambling in the upcoming year. I'd like your opinion on the viability of gambling as a revenue source for states.
No way. I mean, just so that all of you understand, what you were saying, so why is there gambling in the state of Connecticut? There's gambling in the state of Connecticut because that was the choice of the Mashantucket Pequot tribe on the Indian reservation. And the federal law gave them the right to establish gambling on that reservation, which is as autonomous from Connecticut as France or New York or Massachusetts. So that was their choice. But as far as basing the economy of a state on gambling or the economy of a community on gambling, the record clearly says no. I mean, if you go to Atlantic City, once you are outside the buildings that actually house the gambling, it's a war zone. 7 out of, I don't know what it was, I think it's 7 out of the last 9 mayors having all been indicted on corruption charges. I said that the greatest, if Connecticut adopts gambling, the greatest harm that will be done is it will corrupt politics in the state of Connecticut forever. Now, look, whether it's the crime factor, whether it's the disease factor, whether it's the impact that it has on the family values, I go down the whole checklist. There's nothing in this for any community. As far as the jobs are concerned, these are entry-level jobs, period. In the meantime, I'll tell you what you've given up. You honestly don't think that a legitimate business is going to move cheek to jowl with a gambling operation. No way. So you've denied yourself all the other businesses that potentially might come in. And I realize the desperation. God, I was so frustrated while governor with the situation in Bridgeport. This is a tough situation there as far as the people are concerned. It's not a question of not sympathizing with them. And it was the reason why, number one, I established the community college in downtown Bridgeport, to bring the police barracks into downtown, state police barracks into downtown Bridgeport, to bring my own office into downtown Bridgeport. I mean, I've tried to do everything I can while being on my knees to legitimate businesses to come into that community. Indeed, if anybody wants inexpensive real estate and a chance to go ahead and build a business, go to Bridgeport, Connecticut. It's a great community with great people. But I would hope that this matter of gambling in Bridgeport will be rejected. Number one, as far as the people of Bridgeport are concerned. Number two, as far as the people of the state of Connecticut basing their budget on gambling. Yeah.
Hello, Governor Weicker. I have 2 questions for you, and I sort of want to warn you they're going to be somewhat critical. First, I really can't imagine that when you were running for governor, I believe, was it 1989 or 1990, that you must have known about the scope of the problem
No way.
facing.
No way.
No way.
No way.
Didn't
When I started the run for governor, the state was $50 million in debt. $50 million.
But so this came as a complete and total surprise.
And by the end of the campaign, the state was $200 million in debt. Mm-hmm. And by the time I raised my hand and took the oath of office, it was $1 billion. There was no way that you could go ahead and surmise that.
I mean, okay. So actually, I was expecting a different answer to that question, which was going to spark my second question. So I'll revise my question and ask you this. Don't you think a candidate should be at least somewhat responsible for knowing that sort of information, about knowing that the state is in fact in dire circumstances, and then that there's no excuse for going out and saying I'm not going to impose an income tax, and then getting in office and saying, oh my God, I didn't know about that. Whoops, we're going to have to change course.
Again, I have to repeat to you, there was no way of knowing the dimensions of the problem. No candidate has more information than the public does as to the figures released by the government of the state of Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
And a $50 million problem, even a $200 million problem, is not a $1 billion problem. And more to the point, was not just getting the state out of its $1 billion hole, but keeping it out of the hole. And the problem with a sales tax-based revenue system, aside from being the most regressive system in the world, it also subjects you to the peaks and valleys of economic cycles, and the valleys were getting deeper and the peaks were getting very much lower. So it wasn't so much the total amount of revenue from income taxes as the consistency of the income tax compared to the sales tax. And it enabled you to go ahead not only and get a consistency of revenue, but to lower what was then also the highest business taxes in the United States and the highest sales tax in the United States. Everybody likes to forget that part of it. They all came down.
Yeah, but why didn't you make that argument when you were running for governor is my question.
I did. I went ahead and said everything's on the table. When people said, how are you going to go ahead and balance the budget? I said, everything's on the table. There were 3 responses given to that question. Mr. Rowland said, I take the pledge. It's the old pledge thing I already referred to. Or as Peter Sellers would say, the old pledge ploy. Bruce Morrison, the Democrat, said, we'll have a referendum. I don't run. That's one thing I find with the problem. That's one of the problems of the United States. I don't believe in government by poll and referendum. Go and run for office, you lead, and make your choices. And I said everything's on the table. I refuse to go ahead and pin myself down to eliminating any possibility. Yep.
Hello, Governor. My name is Rick Burns. I'm a freshman at the college. I strongly agree with your statement that the political system is strangling our being able to govern the country. But I'd really like to know how you can, in order to govern in this country, you need to be elected. And I'd like to know how you can go home to a district which is, say, has a tremendous labor vote or a tremendous NRA vote and run on these centrist principles. In other words, how do you get into a position to change without change in the first place?
Look, people, we make all these suppositions as to how people are going to react. And, you know, we are, first of all, before we're anything else, human beings. And I can give you the best example of all, my own state of Connecticut, so I'm not pointing fingers at anybody. Which state in the Union, outside of your own, led the anti-war movement in the United States? It was Connecticut. It was Connecticut. It gave Gene McCarthy its most rousing receptions, etc. Now, why do I use that as an example? Because it is the biggest per capita defense producer in the United States of America. And when we went ahead and crafted the toughest gun measures in the last year of my administration, that was achieved by the legislature of a state that manufactures more handguns and weapons than any other state in the Union. So I have to tell you, going out there and what you're talking to is not states or constituencies or organizations. You're talking to people. And yes, I have a great faith in the decency and the intelligence of the American people. And I think we demean it and have been demeaning it for a long time in order to achieve political ends. I will grant you, to show you that I am super confident in myself, and yet I think I understand politics also very well. I said to my campaign manager, Tom DeMore here, a little earlier on, Tom's been with me on most of my campaigns. Tom, I said, there is no doubt about the fact, talking about the presidency, I'm the right man for the job. Okay? That's confidence. And then I turned to him, I said, but the problem is, I'm not the right man in the right times for the job. And that's the point I'm trying to make here as to what all of you have to do with the government of the United States. You've got to speak. Because right now, you're absolutely right. The American public wants to be pandered to. They want the soft landing. They want the free lunch. And that can't be. And we're showing the effects of that in terms of our national stature and in terms of our international role. Yes.
Governor, my name is Dimitri Kupinis. I'm president of the board of directors of the Concord Coalition Citizens Council, and I graduated from the Kennedy School here and the business school last year. I wonder, you may be familiar with the Concord Coalition's Zero Deficit Plan, which I actually developed while I was a student here. And if you are aware of the broad contours of the plan, especially means testing of entitlement programs, I'd like to hear your comment on the plan and also on the other major plans that are being discussed.
Well, I have not looked at the details of all of your plans except to say that I very much favor in a general way exactly what all of you are doing. And I have no problems with means testing. Let me say one thing right now. In terms of balancing that budget, you're right. The entitlements and the spending and the possibility of raising tax, all those things are in play. And I might add, obviously, the restructuring of programs to where they can do a better job. So all these bugaboos that you're not supposed to touch, I don't have any problem with them. None whatsoever.
Could you comment on the Gingrich plans in the House for balancing the budget over 7 years and what the President has commented on in balancing over 10 years?
There's too much the element of nihilism in the contract with America. I mean, what ought to upset all of you, just take a look at one of the elements that receives very short shrift in that plan. Research and development and research and science. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, we are not a big country in terms either of our land mass or our population. Why do you think we sit on top of the world? But we generate out of here. and you start cutting back on those investments, then you're in trouble, big trouble for the future. And let me tell you another thing, because it's a great example, and I'm trying to illustrate my points to, and they're not freakish. You can carry them into a lot of other areas of government. About 2 or 3 years ago, some bright soul down in Washington figured out that we could save $200 million of federal funds by eliminating the tuberculosis monitoring program, taking it out of the Centers for Disease Control, and allowing the states to do the job. Right, sort of sending it back to the states, exactly what you hear now. That was about 3 or 4 years ago, and tuberculosis was almost dead, eradicated. We're now confronted with the fact it's back. And not only that, for the $200 million we've saved, we've already spent $2 billion trying to get an antibiotic or some product that can go ahead and overcome this resistant strain of tuberculosis. So much for saving money at the federal level. Some things the federal government does. This is one of them. The Centers for Disease Control do their job better than the states do theirs on an individual basis. But it illustrates the point that I'm making as to you go program by program, and this nihilism approach, I can't buy it in many different ways. Yeah.
My name's Mark Diaz. I'm a first-year student here at the college. My question regards the possibility of an independent candidate for the presidency. The two major parties have a tremendous amount of economic resources at their disposal. So how do you feel that an independent candidate can effectively campaign against two large money-generating machines, the Republican and Democratic Party, without simply pandering to the people in order to raise money?
Because, again, I repeat what I said before. Don't go on the basis that everybody out there is the lowest common denominator in terms of ideals or what they wish for their nation. I think the money's out there. I'll be very honest with you, what scares me more than anything else, and that's what Clay Mulford's working on, is the ballot access situation. I'm not worried about raising the money. A good centrist candidate can raise the money. The far greater problem is getting on the ballot. That's a much tougher problem. Yep.
Hi, Governor. My name is Brian Higgins. I'm a candidate here at the Kennedy School. In your book, Maverick, you say that Gerald Ford was the greatest president in your lifetime.
That I served under, yeah.
That you served under. And I'd like you to elaborate a little bit as to why.
Well, take a look at who I served under. But certainly we're going to cross Richard Nixon off. Okay. Now we move, who came after Nixon? Ford, so just leave him aside for a minute. Then Carter. Jimmy Carter was one of the smartest men that I've ever met in government, and had absolutely no street smarts whatsoever in terms of running the government. Right. A very decent man, a very intelligent man, and a total disaster in terms of running the government of the United States. After Carter, Reagan, am I correct? Right. Mm-hmm. Well, we're paying, one of the reasons, people always ask me, they always say, oh gosh, Lowell, you act more like a Democrat you've always acted more like a Democrat than a Republican. Why'd you ever become a Republican? I said for two reasons. Number one, and most of you are too young to realize this considering what's happened since Ronald Reagan, Republicans were practitioners of the balanced budget. That's why I joined the party. The Democrats were the big spenders, and they were. And yes, the Republicans stood for balanced budgets. Well, that certainly went out the window with Ronald Reagan. Point number two, we were the constitutional conservatives in the Republican Party. Nowadays, a Republican comes on the floor of the House or Senate every other day wanting to change the Constitution. So those are the two reasons I joined the Republican Party, and both those reasons went out the window with the Reagan administration. There's where the terrific damage, I think, took place. Give the man his credit for the military buildup, that a lot of people will ascribe as to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I'm not here to argue against that point. I tell you what I am here to argue against, because of that unbalanced budget, having achieved the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were bankrupt ourselves a few minutes later, and we haven't been able to capitalize on it worth a damn, because we're broke. We're broke. And so that's why Reagan doesn't qualify. Then then where do we go? And then we go to George Bush. And the president and I just had too many differences on a variety of issues, and some of which I, again, repeat, I think, lent toward what I consider to be not the integrity I expect out of the Oval Office. Bill Clinton, I think, has many of the right instincts. Of course, I didn't serve under Clinton, so I shouldn't take it that far. My problems with Clinton are not so much that we share certainly many common values. It's a matter of leadership and bringing to closure the things which he professes to believe in, but which he always shifts off on. But Jerry Ford was for me, who? Missed what? Oh, well, Jerry Ford, I knew, I came into the House. He was the Republican leader in the House. Served under him as president, know him still well. I get to see him 1 or 2 times a year. I would say a very moderate to conservative Republican. Certainly a budget balancer. I think history will show how many bills he vetoed to try to keep that budget in check. I would say very representative of middle-of-the-road America, of a centrist position. Very honest, decent man. And again, I have to say that the cast of characters that, now, as compared to growing up in my lifetime, that's why I had to correct you. Right. I mean, it was Franklin Roosevelt and seeing him as a kid that brought me into my love affair with politics. It was seeing Harry Truman make very tough decisions that kept me in politics. And yes, the idealism of John F. Kennedy. This was important, too, at a time when we needed that. Also seeing the centrism of an Eisenhower. I mean, I had a lot of great presidents there before I actually got into office. So, and Johnson, again, seeing him. So what I'm saying is that I've seen a lot of presidents during the course of a lifetime, but in terms of those I served under, yeah, I like Jerry Ford. I was very comfortable.
Just one more moment, and I beg your indulgence. I was very curious as to your response to that. It wasn't in the book, and particularly because you seemed to be a leading figure in exposing the corruption of the Republican administration of which you were affiliated in terms of political affiliation, a leading figure in that whole thing, and yet identified as the greatest president that you served under, the individual that pardoned Richard Nixon. Mm-hmm. And I suppose, Governor, it's more significant for me, coming from my generation, mm-hmm. because I will tell you that that whole mess, and President Ford, although not directly involved in it, mm-hmm. by pardoning Nixon, fed into the whole cynicism that
I think you're right.
victimized people, and it was an entire generation's faith in government, my generation, mm-hmm. and many of the people that are here today.
I think you're right too, and that was a mistake on his part. And I don't expect perfection. I don't expect perfection, and certainly in that instance, there wasn't perfection. But I don't, in any manner or shape, disagree with your conclusions from that particular activity.
I was very impressed with your presentation. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jane Kaplan, and I'm a student at the Kennedy School. And actually, what I wanted to ask you about, the gentleman just brought up, which is cynicism. And what keeps me awake at night is worrying about why people are so negative about politics, about politicians, and the people in government. And what I wonder is, it seems plausible to me that politicians are like any other profession. I mean, you have some great plumbers, mm-hmm. some really bad plumbers, and then a whole lot of plumbers in the middle. And that's sort of how I feel about politicians. And I don't think they're any worse than any other sort of group of people. And I wonder if the media, with such intense scrutiny and with focusing so much on the game, like who's up, who's down, why he went there instead of what he said, or just the whole game is contributing.
I think that's, without being critical of the media, the fact is there is that focus on every human being out there. I mean, even if Phil Gramm gets his dearest wish, the second coming, that guy couldn't get elected probably if he ran in the United States. The way the scrutiny exists on the individuals. And I think it's important to remember that again, it's us that's out there. It's us. I happen to be a great opera buff. And, you know, I love that prologue to Pagliacci where the clown stands before the curtain. And he says, as you see the play unravel, because this is a play within a play, as most of you that know the plot of Pagliacci, and he says, the people that are in the play, you know, they're flesh and blood just like all of you in the audience. And the answer is, we that are in politics are just like every one of you that are sitting in these chairs. And that's the genius of politics in America. But I think that it's up to us to say that on our behalf. And very frankly, I don't think the American public are harsh judges. I really don't. I think they've separated out the media, if you will, from common sense and what is important. So as much as it's there, I certainly wouldn't want in any manner, shape, or form to inhibit that freedom of the press. I think it's terribly important to this nation. And just leave it rather in the hands of our peers, which are all of you.
Governor, why don't we take two more questions, and I believe the governor's got a little time to stay around afterward, and those who don't get their questions answered to come forward and ask them there.
Good evening, Governor. My name is Bill Spain, and I'm an off-duty reporter and not so innocent bystander, I suppose. My question is, can anyone who takes money from an interest group, whether as an office holder or as an erstwhile private citizen, ever be truly independent of that money again? And also, it's my belief that Speaker Newt is suffering from the worst case of political hubris that I've seen in my lifetime, and do you agree?
Well, first of all, yes, you can take, in other words, people that contribute to you. You don't think that a political contribution corrupts the recipient. I'm not saying there aren't contributions that have that effect on a particular individual. But obviously I suppose what bothers me here more than anything else is most of the interest groups that have contributed to my campaign over the years have been academic and scientific and environmental and, you know, all those things, of course, which are good interest groups. Well, I don't know how you define good. I mean, why should a corporation be bad? I don't think it should be. Now, what I'm saying to you is that I have not seen my colleagues at any level of government corrupted by an individual or a corporate campaign contribution. That does not mean to say there aren't those instances, and certainly we read about them. As far as Mr. Gingrich is concerned, I don't know enough about his finances or campaign finances to comment on the man, so in the absence of that information, I can't.
No, I asked if he was suffering from hubris or not.
Hey, if you don't have confidence in this business, you're going to get laid low very fast.
Very well.
Yes.
Hi, Governor. I'm Stephanie Sanford. I'm from Texas, and I'm a mid-career student at the Kennedy School. And I wanted to follow up on the guy from the Concord Coalition on the notion of entitlements and entitlement reform to reduce the deficit. And I really appreciate your remarks on being honest and talking tough about tough issues. How would you couch the toughest issue to particularly the elderly and to the American people about taking on the largest entitlement of Social Security?
Well, I think what you want to do is to make sure that you have the money to go ahead and pay for the benefits that you're establishing. And if you can't do that, then you either go ahead and raise the payment or you cut the benefits. Now, without going over specifics, I don't have a Social Security plan here, but as you well know, what went on in Washington for a long period of time is everybody had on a new benefit, and there wouldn't be any increase in the payments. And eventually, yeah, we had to go ahead and rescue that system once before, about 15 years ago, and we're rapidly running into that area again. So as a matter of philosophy or practice, I think I've described to you what I think needs doing without being specific about it.
Do you think that modifications to that, like a means test, should be on the table in the context
Sure.
of deficit reduction?
Why not? No reason why not. I'd like to thank each of you, for spending a few minutes here this evening. As you know, we just concluded the International Special Olympic Summer Games in New Haven, Connecticut. And we had 7,000 athletes from around the world come to see us here in the United States. And I want to tell you, you'd be so proud as American citizens, as to how envious they were over the achievements of the mentally challenged in our country. 94, 142, Education of All Handicapped Children Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, go down the whole checklist. That's your money. Those were your policies that made us the envy of the world and have us as the envy of the world. And yes, it has a special meaning to me. Yeah, I have a retarded son, Sonny Weiger, 17 years old. He was born with Down syndrome. And as I see that community out there all the time, whether it's Special Olympics or wherever, I say to myself, what a wonderful country that took my son and all like him, and in the course of just 25 years, they took him out of that T-shirt and diapers where he sat in a dark corner and brought him into the sunlight of America. So you see, there's always a face to our causes. And if there's one thing I would wish for my nation, it's the oath that each one of these kids takes at the Special Olympics. Let me win, but if I cannot win, let me be brave in the attempt. And I suppose what my greatest sadness is right now, it's not a question of winning, we're not even attempting. Indeed, if the frailest of our citizens can attempt, then I think each one of us can also. For ourselves, but most importantly for our neighbors, because that is the United States of America as I've come to know it in the years that I've spent in its public service. Thank you very much.